this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
Hello and welcome to the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In this episode, we're going to look at Japanese propaganda during the imperial era. With the rise of mass production of newspapers and magazines amidst the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese population became instilled in nationalism and militarism. Despite the era of demilitarisation and democratisation after the First World War, the Japanese Empire once again became fixated on expansion. In harnessing film, radio and cultural institutions, the country was galvanised for total war. I'm joined by Ray Matsumoto, author of Echoes of Empire, The Power of Japanese Propaganda. Now, this podcast is free. If you are a new listener and don't already subscribe, head over to your podcast software of choice and hit the subscribe button to make sure you get your regular dose of World War II chat. And also, this podcast is made possible by listeners like yourself who enjoy the show and help me find the time to put it together by becoming patrons, by committing to $1 or $2 each month via Patreon. And you can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. So, Ray, we're going to be focusing on Japanese government propaganda to try and understand how the government motivated the Japanese people to go to war and fight for Japan. I wonder if our starting point is to try and understand how Japan traditionally saw itself in the early part of the 20th century.
It begins, I think, to change more so in the late 19th century. So in the late 19th century, there's the Meiji Restoration, where before Japan was under the Tokugawa shogunate, which is a caste system. It's a military government, but it's not centralized, and it's feudal in a sense. It's pre-modern. So it controls domains. When the Meiji Restoration occurred, the government became centralized under the emperor, and then it became much more overtly nationalistic. So it really, based on modern and Western-oriented ideologies and concepts, it created more of a nationalist, a more nationhood concept of Japan and then the Japanese people. So it's very much overtly nationalist and militarist and then expansionist in a lot of ways. Of course, it evolves and changes quite a bit throughout the years, but then that's kind of what it's founded on, a sense of nationhood, the concept of Japan, and initially based on Western modernity and then empires, but then eventually becomes opposed to them, if that makes sense.
It is interesting how in that first couple of decades of the 20th century, you get the victory over Russia. Japan's with the allies, the winning allies in the First World War, and I wasn't quite sure then how after those sort of events does that bolster the idea of some sort of military nationalism, or actually shift them ideologically, Japan towards the West?
The start of the 20th century is a pretty complex picture. So after the Sino-Japanese War, so when Japan defeated China, just at the end of the 19th century, there was definitely a boost in Japanese nationalism and militarism because they finally beat China, which kind of they saw as a big brother throughout a very long time in its history. And then there was definitely a rise towards Japanese superiority and exceptionalism in a lot of ways. The Russo-Japanese War is actually quite nuanced, which I think a lot of people overlook, even though it was pretty much kind of the first time a non-Western nation defeated a Western empire, basically. It didn't actually create such a clear image of kind of militarism in Japan. Of course, it kind of increased sentiment towards Japanese exceptionalism in a lot of ways, but it created anti-military activities and sentiment as well for a number of reasons. First of all, because the end of the war, the treaty marked the end of the war, was not very favorable to Japan. It led to significant amount of debt, but then there was a riot called the Hibiya riot in Tokyo that basically was against the treaty, the content of the treaty, and then the military in general, especially towards the army, because the army was not very successful in the Russo-Japanese War. It was more because of the navy that they won. And it also led to a lot of significant amounts of deaths, which led to a kind of a rise in anti-militarism. And then that kind of continued on at the end of World War One, mostly after because of the Siberian intervention. So right around the end of World War One, a group of Japanese army units went to Siberia to fight the communists, the Soviet communists. But then that was very unsuccessful. And then that also led to countless deaths and a lot of debt. And it caused a bit of an economic recession in Japan, which led to more riots, most famously the rice riots in 1918 in Japan. And then once they signed all the treaties that marked anti-militarism after the war, it just kind of created the sentiment towards democracy and liberal ideology that was inherently anti-military throughout kind of the 1920s during the Taisho period.
I was going to try and draw a parallel with Germany here, the Weimar Republic in the 20s, and then the rise of military nationalism, because the Germans point to that stab in the back at the end narrative about the end of the First World War. You know, we didn't lose the war; we were stabbed in the back by the politicians. Is the rise of the military in Japan purely based on, you know, I was going to say economics? Where does that Japanese military nationalist sort of sentiment government come from from the late 20s, I guess?
It actually was, for the most part, based on economic factors. So during the Taisho period, there was a strong movement, both politically and culturally, towards Western thought, Western culture, Western democracy, mostly based on American kind of values. But then once the Great Depression hit, it led to a rise of radical ideology, which tends to happen throughout history, and then created an opportunity for militarists to rise up and promote concepts of nationalism and militarism and more radical ideologies of that kind that formed the new system of Japanese military government or system that emerged in the 1930s. And that was in large part because of propaganda that they promoted during that period, during what happened in the Great Depression, when it hit Japan, because it created a narrative where the military can save Japan from economic hardship. It created a narrative that kind of Western ideology is the blame to this suffering that Japan was now experiencing, especially when looking at what happened before kind of the Taisho period, before the economic rise, when after World War One, Japan tries to impose a policy to the League of Nations of anti-racism towards Asians, which was quickly rejected by the US and the UK, I believe. And then they used that kind of narrative of Western hypocrisy in order to promote Japanese nationalism. And that's when this thought of opposing Western modernity kind of emerged in Japan, as opposed to seeing it as a kind of goal towards what Japan could be. It became kind of something that they fought against towards kind of this more overtly pan-Asian narrative that emerged more later on in the 1930s.
Sort of fighting against the cultural propaganda of the West, I guess. Cultural imperialism of the West. So when the nationalist and military groups are sort of starting to push these messages, I wondered, from the point of view of perhaps the media, is there a history of state censorship within Japan? Who's controlling the media? Is it like the West, where there's magnets that control everything from the media point of view and push ideas? Or is it all state controlled? For
the most part, it is state controlled. But then I want to emphasize how much local censorship or internal censorship was kind of significant and important during that period of, especially from the 1930s to the end of World War II, because there is a long history of Japanese government censorship that emerged from the Tokugawa period. which obviously is before the imperial period. And then they became more strict and kind of different in a way during the Meiji era, where it was more oriented towards censoring narratives that was anti-government, anti-Meiji regime, anti-imperial. So they were very strict on communism, for example, throughout the whole period. That was very much the primary target throughout the period of Japanese censorship.
Is there a propaganda ministry controlling everything, controlling a message, or is it sort of self-mobilized, the way that the propaganda works?
So in terms of censorship, it was mostly controlled by what was called the Home Ministry. So it's the Internal Affairs Ministry that kind of censored mostly newspapers, media outlets, and books, publications, in order to kind of promote this idea of Japanese nationalism. But then when it came to propaganda, there were a lot of attempts to create a system of propaganda ministry that's similar to Nazi Germany, but they were quite unsuccessful. And that kind of comes down to the system or the structure of Japanese, the Meiji Constitution and the government, because the military has a lot of freedom where it has significant autonomy from the civilian leadership, which makes creating a propaganda ministry very difficult because the army can just do something else on its own. And there's a lot of opposed agendas and ideologies that are trying to fight towards creating a singular narrative of Japanese nationalism. And that's also within the military as well, because the army and the navy have quite contrary beliefs and ideas and messages that they want to present to the people. So in a lot of ways, it was more mobilized by civilians. So civilians kind of took up what was kind of left out from government propaganda to promote their own narrative of Japanese nationalism, mostly through kind of local organizations, local associations. And then later on, in 1942, roughly, the government created what was called the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, where it attempted to create kind of like a system that encompassed every organization when it came to propaganda or things of that nature. So every local administration, local association, organization, including like youth and female organizations, became part of this large system. And a lot of people kind of point to that as the Japanese version of the propaganda ministry, but they had no real significant autonomy or voice when it came to the content of propaganda. They just were kind of like a figurehead, in so to speak.
Rubber stamping things. Other people put their message forward and they sort of okayed it and let it carry on. The message is coming from below and they just oversee it and step in if they feel the message was off message.
Yeah, I think that is a good way to put it. Of course, the government had a lot of say when it came to what kind of narrative that they want local administrations to present, of course. But there was quite a bit of freedom among those groups as well.
So it's a two-way conversation. At the localities, there's an idea of the Japanese of Japaneseness that's been promoted, of which the government's reflects back on them. In which case, what is the sort of general idea of Japaneseness that has been promoted, that has been or been is seen as being acceptable for being promoted?
In general, the concept of Japanese exceptionalism and superiority compared to first the Asia, so mostly China, Korea, and then like later on Southeast Asia. But then it also targeted the West, especially during the Asia Pacific War, when it came to creating the sense of Japanese superiority, not just military or economy, but racially and like ideologically and in terms of virtue. And what became very significant and important to that narrative was concepts of Japanese tradition, which very much targeted female groups and the youth. So when it came to Japanese women and girls, propagandists very much promoted concepts of chastity, motherhood, and that very, very traditional concepts, very, I guess, Confucian-rooted concepts of what it means to be a Japanese woman. And a lot of them were very, very much misogynist, very inherently kind of male dominant. ideologies and ideas. But that's what I think encompasses what both the civilians and the government wanted Japan to be, like a traditional kind of unique country that promoted Japanese exceptionalism in that way, and that was different from its Asian neighbors who were inferior, and it's the Western empires that were kind of this evil being that was trying to, control these Asian territories through imperialism and expansionism.
Is there any unusually specific outlets for Japanese propaganda? Because there was a few I picked up in the book which I thought was fascinating, like the woodcut artistry in favour of photographs.
So the Nishiki paintings, woodblock paintings, they're based off what is called ukiyo-e. So it's a very traditional form of artwork that became really popular during the Tokugawa period and then kind of continued on throughout the Meiji period. By itself, it's not propagandist. It's a form of art, of course. But the reason why I emphasize Nishiki in the book is because of its more propagandist nature when it came to the Meiji period, especially when it came to promoting the Sino-Japanese War and then depicting concepts of or depicting scenes from battle, because photography was very much in its early stage. It couldn't really capture what was happening in the battlefield, and then civilians couldn't really be there in the battlefront to explain what was happening during the war and capture what was happening during these battles. So artists, especially these Nishiki painters, became very influential in depicting a very dramatic and colorful and overtly very kind of nationalistic, I suppose, picture of what was happening during the war. What's very significant is how the artistic nature of it, because it's so dramatized, and then a lot of it is kind of based off of kind of word of mouth and then inaccurate information. But it created kind of a very dramatized picture and a very colorful picture of what was happening, which made it really popular among a lot of Japanese people during that period.
It's fascinating because it's a very specific Japanese form of artwork, which again must work to reinforce the idea of a specific Japaneseness. And the other one, the paper theatre.
Kamishibai, yeah.
But that had been banned and then gets a resurgence in the 30s.
Yes, I really enjoyed researching this because Kamishibai is something that still exists today. It's very rare now, but I grew up watching some Kamishibai on some occasions growing up. There's precursors to Kamishibai, so paper theater during the Meiji period and the Taisho period, but then what's really known as Kamishibai was created more, I believe, in the Showa era. And so originally it wasn't meant to be a form of propaganda, of course. It's street theater, mostly for kids, that depict stories that are more kind of as like TV shows for children in a sense during that period. And it's very entertaining, very colorful, very dramatic in a way. It becomes heavily censored during the mid-30s. So during the national spiritual mobilization movement, when the Japanese government tries to use these outlets such as Kamishibai to promote Japanese militarism and nationalism because of the start of the Second Sino-Japanese War. And it lost a lot of its more entertaining factors during that period, especially during the 40s. It became overtly propagandistic in the sense that it promoted very traditional values and then more military-based values, as opposed to being a kind of entertainment for children. Well, of course, it retained a lot of its entertaining aspect, which is why it continued to be popular throughout that period.
Am I right in saying that it becomes state organized as well, or at least there's a state association put in place in the 30s to oversee it as well, to make sure it's on message?
Yes.
Which I think is fascinating.
Yes, exactly.
You know, when say other people are controlling radios, they're kind of and TV, and someone's gone back to like, what's a very traditional Japanese thing, which then reinforces again a message of Japaneseness. And to children, the Germans are obviously have got the Hitler Youth politicising children. Is there a similar campaign within Japan of politicising education, indoctrinating the next generation?
Yes, indoctrinating the next generation, that is very much priority to a lot of not just government, but civilian propagandists throughout, especially the 1930s. There wasn't a very successful campaign like the Nazi youth organization. There were attempts to create these organizations or groups throughout the Asia-Pacific War, but none of them became quite as successful compared to its German counterparts. But education became very much a significant form of propaganda, or what I like to call pre-propaganda, a kind of condition that not just promotes propaganda, but kind of creates this need for propagandistic narratives. And one of the more fascinating stories is the Bakudan Sanyushi, or the three human bombs. And it's a story about how these three brave soldiers during the Shanghai incident sacrificed themselves for the victory of the Japanese army. And it's heavily exaggerated to fit this narrative of self-sacrifice for the greater good of the Japanese empire. And it became instilled in Japanese education because it became part of textbooks during the 30s. And then not just that, but children even reenacted it during playtime and whatnot. And it really shows how much it instilled within children this concept of self-sacrifice. And it wasn't just something that, teachers were trying to push on to children, but it's something that they very much internalized, which is seen especially in the late stages of the Pacific War, when these children become adults and then they participate in suicide attacks against the U.S. primarily through kamikaze attacks or banzai attacks in Okinawa, for example.
Did the author write it and then it became a hit and the government then jumped on the bandwagon, or did the government actually have it written to portray the message? So is it a form of self-mobilised that the government have then mobilised propaganda that the government have then jumped on and promoted?
More the latter. It was covered by a lot of newspaper outlets pretty early on, and then the government did kind of jump on it, and then the education ministry kind of adopted it into their own system. And it really shows how much an influence media had. And of course, the government was heavily censoring media and was in charge of creating the narrative. But of course, there was a lot of autonomy depending on the companies and what kind of content they want to promote. But it really shows how quick and kind of important they were to creating these narratives and kind of pushing these stories to the Japanese people.
From the Western perspective, it's easy to think this war starts for Britain in 1939, war with Japan's sort of 41. But for Japan, the war starts, in the 30s. How much is propaganda linked to mobilising the nation for war, as opposed to just mobilising the nation to as a unit, an identity, as an idea? Is everything built to support the war?
There's a reason why a lot of historians call Japan's war a total war, very much because civilians played a very active part in promoting and mobilizing towards war. So what's usually considered the Asia-Pacific War in terms of Japan starts in 1931. 1928, I suppose, depending on who you ask. But generally speaking, 1931, when they invade Manchuria after the Mukden incident, which kind of is called the 15-year war. That in itself was propagated by radicals in the army. And it wasn't, they had no permission from the emperor, for instance, or higher level leadership. It was something that the more radical members of the army conducted, which led to the invasion of Manchuria. And for instance, the prime minister, Inokai Tsuyoshi, was opposed to the invasion of Manchuria, but then he was later assassinated by ultra-nationalist members, not of the army, but ultra-nationalist groups, which promoted this concept of kind of suppressing anti-military ideas within the government, especially within the civilian government. So that's when the military kind of took over. the role propaganda had, which is significant, was that it really created a narrative that they needed to go to war and take over Manchuria because Japan really needed these resources in Manchuria because of the Great Depression. And you see how effective that was when the people who assassinated the prime minister, when they were being indicted and charged, so many people, so many civilians wrote to the government to say that please let them go or please let them have a light sentence because they were doing something that was for the benefit of the people of Japan. And you can see from that picture in the late 30s, 1930s, that propaganda and then just the civilian values and ideas was and to mobilize towards war and how they were very much part of this direction towards war against China and then eventually against the West that later emerged. Of course, there's a lot of people still opposed to it in that early period as well, but then they were definitely minorities, and then those minorities fizzled out or very much suppressed even further as the war or as the Asia-Pacific War continued into the 40s.
What's interesting then is we've been looking at propaganda, selling propaganda to the Japanese people. When they're fighting the Chinese in Manchuria, they'll obviously go across the Pacific. How are they depicting other nationalities? There's a problem depicting them one way and then not, are you conqueror or liberator? How do the Japanese work that balance from the propaganda perspective, or do they never manage to square that circle?
It's a very complex picture for sure, because different groups within Japan, of course, want to depict, the others, I suppose, in a different light. But generally speaking, when it came to Asia, so Southeast Asia wasn't really considered Asia within Japanese concepts of what Asia was. It was more just within East Asia, so China, and then, of course, Manchuria, Korea, Taiwan, that region. And early on, the Japanese people and then the government had kind of a picture to become this Pan-Asian regime or this Pan-Asian system of Greater East Asia, what is called. And then what's interesting is that there is no very concrete image of what that was going to be throughout not just the 30s, but even towards the 40s. But when it came to propaganda, it was more this message of liberator, especially when it came to Southeast Asia. Japan was the liberator of Western imperialism, and we're going to free these quote unquote inferior people from this oppressive regime. And then we're going to create this system of Pan-Asianism and this new regime and create kind of a new peace on earth in the kind of way. So in a lot of ways, it was both depicting them as inferior, but then not overtly, savages or something like that, but more towards like people that we're going to educate and people that we're going to, foster into this new system, this new peaceful system of Pan-Asian empire headed by Japan.
Because I think it's fascinating that they then pushed for the Olympics in 1940, and they, in theory, would have held the 1940 Olympics, which is interesting because presumably that's selling an idea of Japaneseness on three levels to the local, to the Japanese people, to the Pacific area, and then to the world. Did they have a sort of a strategy to use the Olympics to promote Japan? Or what was the thinking behind it, even pushing for it?
Generally speaking, I don't know how much the government had kind of an image towards promoting Japan in the Olympics. So before 1940, there was very much this surge in popularity when it came to Olympics and sports in general in Japan. They became very successful in the Olympics throughout from the early 20th century towards the Berlin Olympics. They finally created sports organization associations, and then they trained athletes, and then they won gold, and not a lot, but then a significant amount of sports throughout that period, or it evolved to the success in the Berlin Olympics. And then I think inevitably success in sports kind of creates the sentiment of nationalism, because it really kind of unites people under this event and support Japan or the Japanese athletes, and quite directly shows how they're superior physically compared to Westerners, which is a big thing, being them in their own sport, pretty much. I think that momentum kind of created the need to host the Olympics in Japan. And then that eventually became a tool for the government to promote Japanese physical exceptionalism and show how Japanese athletes, and then who were also a lot of times Japanese soldiers, were physically dominant, and to kind of go against Western stereotypes and ideas that, Japanese and Asians are physically inferior or racially inferior, inherently inferior. It really was meant to promote this idea that Japanese people were very much on par or superior to the white counterpart, so to speak.
Yeah, I also wondered if it demonstrated to Japan's neighbours in the Pacific that it is the leading nation. It is hosting what is it's a Western event, isn't it? It's from Greece. It's held up there, and so we're the leading light of the Pacific Rim and sort of Asia. But if you think about American propaganda, how it projects a very stereotypical version of the Japanese people, I wonder how did the Japanese depict other nationalities within the Pacific Rim? Do they have a stereotypical view of them? And it's probably a bit too simplistic to give everybody a broad brush. I imagine there's a lot of nuance.
I suppose there is quite a bit of nuance. I mean, generally speaking, when it came to their Asian neighbors, so mostly Southeast Asians who were colonized by the US and the UK and the Dutch, they were depicted not very much as like savages of that kind. Of course, they're pictured as inferior, and I guess savagery in a way, but then most propaganda wanted to paint them more in a lighthearted way, to promote this concept of Pan-Asianism, to show how Japan's going to save them, and turn them into people like the Japanese, if that makes sense. But when it came to depicting the West, especially during the Pacific War, it was more overtly kind of stereotypical. The leaflets, I think, are the best example of showing how much the Japanese military, especially, and then the Japanese people in general, saw, especially Americans, as kind of savagery or very greedy people that struggled to maintain virtue or to suppress their greedy or their base nature of that kind and stuff like that. And it's really relevant when it came to depicting Western women, so especially American women, in leaflets. They were very sexualized because they believed that American soldiers and other Allied soldiers would be kind of trans towards these erotic depictions of women, and then these very misogynist depictions of women, which very much was in contrast to how they depicted Japanese women in the home front, very chaste and very traditional, very virtuous. So in that way, it was very much similar to how the Americans depicted the Japanese throughout the war, very much as kind of almost as like monsters of some kind, unhuman, very dehumanizing in a lot of ways. But there is a lot more nuance when you look at kind of the Pacific Rim as a whole and how they depicted people within that sphere.
Ray, hold it there. We're going to take a short break. Folks, we'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. I'm joined by Ray Matsumoto, and we're discussing propaganda in Japan. Considering, in many respects, the Japanese wanting to be partners, although lead partners, and create this greater East Asian cooperative prosperity sphere, how do they become tyrants of rather than liberators as the war progressed? Does this fit with the propaganda? Does propaganda indeed have a role to play?
Well, ideally, the government and propagandists want to continue to depict Japan as the liberators and the saviors of Asia. Of course, as Japan become more desperate at the end of the Pacific War, they became much more aggressive. And in many cases, they're quite aggressive from the start, of course. What they depicted in propaganda, unsurprisingly, was not quite accurate when it came to how they occupied and treated locals. And it was very brutal and violent throughout the period, especially in areas like the Philippines and the Dutch East Indies. But they continued to try to depict themselves as kind of the leader of this Pan-Asian peaceful regime to the end of the war, basically.
Do they have a propaganda program for those countries that they've liberated to try and convince them of Japanese, I guess, perhaps not exceptionalism, but at least friendliness, and how they should be actually siding with the Japanese?
Yes, it of course depends on the local government within each occupied territory, because they're quite split in a lot of ways, and they don't necessarily work amongst each other. But for example, in the Philippines, interestingly enough, when the army invaded the Philippines, they brought in a propaganda corps that was made up of civilians that were tasked to create Japanese propaganda that was meant to create friendship, so to speak, amongst the Filipinos and the Filipinos. And it was very significant to the Japanese that they create this friendship among people in the Philippines, because it was in a U.S. territory, and they really wanted to split the locals from the Americans, the American occupiers. And although the propaganda corps was under the army, and then had to some extent, had to kind of work under strict censorship and then strict guidelines, so to speak. But kind of artistically, in a way, they had a lot of freedom. So it shows how much civilians kind of played a role in actually how they depicted the Japanese and how they wanted to present these ideas of Japanese friendship and Japanese Pan-Asianism, especially in these occupied territories.
I'm not sure how you measure success, but I was going to say, I wonder how successful the Army Propaganda Corps was.
Generally speaking, in Southeast Asia, most locals, I don't want to speak too generally, but a lot of locals were very welcoming towards the Japanese initially, because they really hoped that they're going to be liberated by the Japanese and become independent. Because of course they, as much as they eventually disliked Japanese occupation, they really disliked Western occupation, of course, especially the Philippines and other territories as well. But of course, once they realized how brutal the Japanese were as well, it kind of flipped on its head, basically. And there were a lot of resistance and movements towards to resist Japan. And Korea, for example, which I think is quite overlooked in a lot of historical sources, especially about Japanese propaganda, from the start was very resistant to Japanese leadership. And in a lot of ways, propaganda was not successful in Korea when it came to trying to indoctrinate the Korean people under Japanese leadership.
Wartime propaganda very much can shape how we view the war today. I wonder how wartime propaganda, if it's worked to shape modern Japanese society.
It very much has. It's very nuanced, because a lot of it is indirect, of course. But there are a lot of people in the post-war era who were products of Japanese propaganda and kind of used it in their career. So, for example, like famous authors or directors or artists were products of Japanese propaganda and used that in the post-war era to continue to propagate some nationalist narratives throughout Japan. Of course, a lot of it was not overly nationalistic or exceptionist like what existed during the war, but it definitely did continue. And what's also interesting is how much of the Japanese leadership, especially when it came to the creation of propaganda, continued to exist after the war. So although the Meiji regime or the Meiji Constitution and this system was dissolved by the American occupation, a lot of the leaders continued to hold their positions. Of course, the head, so to speak, apart from the emperor, a lot of them were executed or sentenced to prison time during the Tokyo trial. but a lot of them returned, or quite a few of them continued to hold very significant positions in the government. And of course, they couldn't quite depict or propagate very overtly militarist narratives, of course, after the war, but very much the sense of Japanese exceptionalism continued, especially when you consider what happened with the economic rise of Japan from the 60s and onward. This ideology of Japanese uniqueness, or Nihonjin-ron, as it's called, really became popular during that period as well, which is from these more radical nationalist ideas that emerged during the imperial era.
Well, Ray, thanks. It really is a fascinating topic. Loyal listener, if you want to read more on the subject, Ray's book is Echoes of Empire: The Power of Japanese Propaganda. Don't forget you can sign up to be a patron of the podcast for ad-free listening and extras when I have them, and you can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. Well, that is all for this episode of the show. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town, blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice